Picture the Fields of Crécy in the year 1346. A storm of arrows darkening the sky as English longbowmen stand firm against the thunder of French knights. This wasn't just a battle, it was the moment medieval Europe's balance of power shattered. The flower of French chivalry, clad in gleaming armor, fell beneath a hail of arrows from humble yeomen, a clash that would echo for generations. The 100 Years' War had begun, not as a single conflict, but as a series of explosive confrontations that would redefine kingdoms, forge legends, and leave an indelible mark on history. But here's what most people miss. This war wasn't a relentless, century-long grind. It was a saga of turning points, battles so pivotal that each one could have rewritten the future of England and France. From the muddy fields of Agincourt to the sieges that tested the limits of loyalty, every engagement was a chess move in a grand, brutal game. What if we could step onto those battlefields, not just from one side, but from both? What if we could see the desperation of the French as their nobility crumbled, or the resolve of the English as they clung to distant shores? That's exactly what we're about to do. Over 25 key battles, we'll unravel the strategies, the blunders, and the human stories behind this epic struggle. We'll meet kings and commanders whose decisions shaped nations, and soldiers whose courage defied the odds. This isn't just a tale of conquest, it's a window into how wars are won, lost, and remembered. So ready yourself for a journey through the heart of medieval conflict, where every clash reveals another layer of this unforgettable war. The story begins now. To understand how England and France plunged into a war that would span generations, we have to rewind to the early 14th century, a time when borders were fluid, loyalties were tangled, and a king's ambition could shake continents. At the heart of it all was a question of bloodlines. Edward III of England, grandson of Francis Philip IV, believed the French crown rightfully belonged to him. But across the Channel, Philip VI of the House of Valois had been crowned instead, backed by French nobles who insisted their throne couldn't pass through a foreign king. This wasn't just family drama, it was a powder keg waiting to explode. Adding fuel to the fire was Gascony, a wealthy region in southwestern France that had been under English control for generations. The French monarchy, eager to centralize power, saw it as a rogue territory, while England viewed any challenge to their rule there as an act of war. Tensions simmered as Philip VI demanded Edward pay homage for Gascony, a feudal gesture that would acknowledge French supremacy. Edward, ever the strategist, played along at first, but neither side truly trusted the other. Diplomacy became a chess game of broken promises and veiled threats. Then came the final straw, Philip's decision to confiscate Gascony in 1337. For Edward, this wasn't just a loss of land, it was an insult to his royal dignity. Within months, he formally declared himself the rightful king of France, adopting the fleur-de-lis alongside England's lions on his coat of arms. The stage was set, but here's what's fascinating. Neither side expected a century of bloodshed. Edward likely saw it as a bold gambit to force concessions, while Philip assumed his armies would quickly crush the upstart English. What they didn't foresee was how deeply their fates would intertwine, how a dispute over titles and territories would spiral into a war of survival, reshaping armies, economies, and even the very idea of kingship. The road to war wasn't paved with grand strategy alone. It was littered with pride, miscalculations, and the weight of history pressing down on two kingdoms destined to collide. The first thunderous clash of the 100 Years' War didn't unfold on land. but on the choppy waters off the Flemish coast where Edward III's audacity met France's pride in a naval showdown that would change everything. In the summer of 1340, the French assembled a formidable fleet at Sluys, their ships chained together in a defensive wall meant to repel invaders. Admiral Queret, confident in this traditional tactic, believed his floating fortress would crush any English assault. But Edward, ever the innovator, saw weakness in their rigidity. His plan turned their defense into a death trap. As dawn broke on June 24th, the English fleet descended like wolves. Instead of engaging at a distance, Edward's archers rained arrows down on the packed French decks, their longbows punching through armor and sowing chaos. Then came the grapples, iron hooks hurled across the gaps, binding ships together as English men-at-arms swarmed aboard. The French, trapped in their own rigid formation, couldn't maneuver. What followed was less a battle than a slaughter, deck by bloody deck. By day's end, nearly 200 French ships were captured or sunk, their admiral dead, and the Channel's waters ran red with the cost of misplaced confidence. This wasn't just a victory, it was a masterclass in adaptation. Edward had exploited France's reliance on outdated tactics, proving that flexibility could overpower sheer numbers. With the Channel now an English highway, troops and supplies could flow freely to the continent, setting the stage for the land campaigns to come. Yet the triumph at Sluys also revealed a deeper truth. Control of the sea meant little without footholds on land. Edward's next move would test whether lightning could strike twice, this time on French soil. The stage was set for a far more famous confrontation, one where mud, rain, and a hail of arrows would etch another name into history: Crécy. The fields near Crécy in August 1346 were anything but the glorious stage France's nobility had imagined for their triumph. Days of relentless rain had turned the ground into a quagmire, the kind that sucked at horses' hooves and slowed armor-clad knights to a crawl. Yet Philip VI, certain of his divine right to victory, ordered wave after wave of cavalry charges up the slippery slope where Edward III's forces waited. What happened next wasn't just a defeat, it was a reckoning. Edward had chosen his ground with cold precision. His army, though outnumbered, perched on a hillside flanked by woods, funneling the French into a killing zone. At the forefront stood his secret weapon, thousands of longbowmen, their weapons capable of firing 10 arrows a minute with enough force to pierce plate armor at 200 yards. As the first French knights lumbered forward, their heavy horses struggling in the mud, the sky darkened with English arrows. The effect was catastrophic. Horses reared in panic, throwing riders into the churned earth, only to be trampled by the next disorganized charge. Philip's feudal levies, raised in haste and lacking coordination, became their own worst enemy. Without unified command, fresh troops pushed forward relentlessly, piling onto the chaos. Noblemen, eager for personal glory, ignored trumpets signaling retreat. Meanwhile, Edward's disciplined dismounted knights held the line, turning back the few French who reached the crest. By nightfall, the wheat fields ran red. Thousands of French dead, including the flower of their aristocracy, lay heaped in the muck. Among them was Philip's own brother, the Count of Alençon, whose gold-trimmed surcoat failed to save him from an English dagger. Crécy wasn't just a battle, it was a funeral for medieval warfare's old order. The longbow, once dismissed as a peasant's tool, had proven deadlier than the most expensive armor. Edward's reliance on disciplined infantry and terrain over brute cavalry force marked a seismic shift in military strategy. But the battle's aftermath was equally revealing. While Philip fled in humiliation, Edward, ever the pragmatist, didn't press toward Paris. Instead, he marched north to besiege Calais, securing a vital port that would remain English for over 2 centuries. In that choice lay the deeper lesson of Crécy. Winning a war required not just battlefield brilliance, but the patience to turn victory into lasting advantage. The French, however, weren't finished. Humiliation at Crécy bred a desperate need for redemption, one that would soon lead to an even greater disaster at Poitiers. But that's a story for another clash. After the carnage at Crécy, Edward III didn't march triumphantly toward Paris. He made a colder, more calculated choice, one that would test not just his army's strength, but the limits of human endurance. The port city of Calais, with its towering walls and strategic harbor, became his obsession. For nearly a year, from September 1346 to August 1347, the siege of Calais unfolded as a brutal chess match between starvation and stubbornness. Inside the city walls, Governor Jean de Vienne faced an impossible task. Edward's forces had encircled Calais completely, cutting off supply lines by land and sea. As months dragged on, the citizens ate through their grain stores, then their livestock, and finally resorted to boiling leather belts for broth. By spring, whispers of desperation turned to open revolt. Starving townspeople begged de Vienne to surrender, but he held firm, betting on the arrival of a French relief army. That hope would prove fatal. Philip VI, still reeling from Crécy, assembled a massive force to break the siege, but Edward had anticipated this. His engineers had transformed the marshy terrain around Calais into a fortified camp, complete with wooden towers and trenches. When Philip's army finally arrived in late July, they found the English positions impregnable. After a week of futile skirmishes, the French king made a shocking decision. He ordered his troops to withdraw, abandoning Calais to its fate. The citizens, watching their last hope vanish over the horizon, knew their ordeal was only beginning. Edward's terms were merciless. He demanded 6 of the city's wealthiest burghers present themselves with nooses around their necks, ready to hang as punishment for Calais' defiance. Only the intervention of Queen Philippa, kneeling in a moment of legendary compassion, spared their lives, but the message was clear: resistance carried a price. Calais would become England's gateway to the continent, a bristling fortress where English wool merchants and soldiers lived side by side for over 200 years. The siege revealed a harsh truth of medieval warfare. Logistics often mattered more than valor. Edward's patient strangulation of Calais showcased England's growing mastery of siegecraft, while France's failure to relieve the city exposed the fragility of feudal mobilization. But this wasn't the end. It was merely the prelude to an even greater shock. A decade later, at Poitiers, the French would learn that no wall or harbor could compare to the disaster of a king in chains. The fields near Poitiers in September 1356 should have been a stage for French redemption, a chance to erase the shame of Crécy. Instead, they became the setting for one of history's most astonishing blunders. King John II of France, convinced his heavily armored knights would crush the English once and for all, led his army straight into a trap laid by Edward III's son, the Black Prince. What unfolded wasn't just a battle, but a masterclass in how overconfidence can unravel even the mightiest forces. The Black Prince's situation seemed desperate. His raiding force, deep in French territory, was outnumbered nearly 2-1 and low on supplies. But where others saw weakness, the 26-year-old prince saw opportunity. He positioned his men on a wooded hillside flanked by marshes, forcing the French to attack through a narrow bottleneck. Then came his most audacious move. He dismounted most of his knights, mixing them with archers in a formation that blurred traditional battle lines. When the French vanguard charged, they met not a scattered enemy, but a disciplined wall of English longbowmen and men at arms ready to fight on foot. King John's forces repeated Crécy's mistakes with tragic precision. his first wave of knights, bogged down in thick undergrowth, became easy targets for arrows. The second wave, instead of regrouping, piled chaotically into the fray. By the time John himself led the reserve forward, his army was already collapsing. In the brutal melee that followed, the French king fought like a lion, sword in hand, his crown visible beneath his helmet, until he was surrounded and captured by a group of English esquires. The unthinkable had happened, a monarch of France taken prisoner on the battlefield. Poitiers revealed a stark contrast in military evolution. While France clung to the fading ideal of chivalric cavalry charges, England had perfected a deadly synthesis of archery and dismounted combat. The Black Prince's victory wasn't just tactical, it was psychological. The capture of a king shattered the myth of French invincibility and sent shockwaves through a kingdom already reeling from plague and peasant revolts. But the aftermath proved just as consequential. King John's ransom was set at 3 million gold crowns, a sum so vast it dwarfed England's annual revenue. The negotiations exposed France's crumbling finances and forced desperate taxation, sparking unrest that would boil over into the Jacquerie uprising. Meanwhile, the Black Prince's reputation soared, his name whispered with equal parts awe and dread across Europe. Yet even this triumph carried seeds of future strife. The ransom enriched England but deepened French resentment, ensuring the war's next phase would be fought not just on battlefields, but in the hearts of a people pushed to their limits. The road ahead would twist unexpectedly as both kingdoms grappled with the weight of Poitiers' legacy. France, humiliated but not broken, would soon find a leader who understood that to defeat England, they'd need to reinvent themselves entirely. That reckoning would come not in open battle, but in the patient, relentless strategy of a king who knew how to wait. Edward III stood at the gates of Rheims in the winter of 1359, snow crunching underfoot as he gazed at the cathedral where French kings were crowned. This was to be his moment, the culmination of a decade of victories from Sluys to Poitiers. With King John of France still imprisoned in London, Edward planned to legitimize his claim by being anointed with the sacred oil of Clovis. But the French had learned from their disasters. What awaited him wasn't a surrendering populace, but a masterclass in defiance. The countryside had turned against him. French peasants burned their own crops rather than let English foragers eat. Bridges lay shattered, wells were poisoned, and bands of partisans ambushed supply trains. Even the weather conspired against Edward. The coldest winter in memory left his troops shivering in makeshift camps. Rheims itself, though weakly garrisoned, shut its gates and manned its walls with citizens armed with little more than hatred. Edward's siege engines pounded the city for weeks, but without adequate supplies, his army withered. The Coronation March had become a humiliating retreat. This was France's new war, not of glittering charges, but of patience and pain. Charles the Dauphin, acting as regent for his captive father, understood something crucial. England could win battles, but couldn't hold a kingdom that refused to be held. Every burned village, every sabotaged road, bled Edward's army a little more. By spring, the English were staggering back toward Normandy, their ranks thinned by hunger and disease. The myth of invincibility had cracked. The Treaty of Brétigny in 1360 should have been Edward's triumph. It granted England vast territories, Calais, Gascony, and nearly a third of France in exchange for renouncing his claim to the throne. But the terms revealed exhaustion on both sides. France, bankrupt and leaderless, needed respite. England, though victorious, couldn't sustain endless campaigning. Most telling was a secret clause. The treaty's ratification depended on the release of King John, who'd been held hostage for 4 years. When John died in English custody in 1364, whether from illness or despair, the fragile peace unraveled. What Reims and Brétigny really marked was a shift in the war's nature. France had discovered the power of resilience, while England learned that occupation was far harder than conquest. The next phase wouldn't be decided by arrows or armor, but by which kingdom could endure the slow grind of attrition, and who would emerge to lead a broken France toward redemption. That answer would come from an unlikely figure, a bookish teenager who'd watched his nation's humiliation from the shadows and would one day be known as Charles the Wise. By 1372, England's grip on the Channel had slipped. The once dominant navy that triumphed at Sluys now faced a new threat, one that didn't play by the old rules. Off the coast of La Rochelle, Castilian galleys sliced through the waves, their high prows adorned with painted saints and iron rams glinting in the afternoon sun. These weren't the lumbering cogs of medieval tradition, but sleek Mediterranean warships crewed by veterans of the Reconquista. When they closed with the English fleet, the result wasn't a battle, it was annihilation. The disaster at La Rochelle didn't happen by chance. France's Charles V, learning from past naval defeats, had forged an alliance with Castile's Enrique II, offering trade privileges and territorial concessions in exchange for maritime muscle. The Castilians brought something England lacked: specialized warships designed for ramming and boarding, not just transporting troops. Their galleys, powered by banks of oars, could maneuver independently of the wind, outflanking English vessels stranded in calm seas. Worse still, England's admirals underestimated the threat until it was too late. The Earl of Pembroke, commanding a convoy of reinforcements for English-held Aquitaine, sailed straight into the trap. What followed was a masterclass in asymmetric warfare. The Castilians didn't bother with arrow volleys. They drove their galleys like daggers into the sides of English ships, shearing oars and puncturing hulls. Grappling hooks flew, and armored Castilian marines swarmed aboard, cutting down defenders before they could form shield walls. Pembroke himself was captured, his flagship engulfed in flames. By nightfall, the Channel's waters were littered with wreckage, and England's naval supremacy was broken. La Rochelle's aftermath rippled far beyond a single defeat. With the sea lanes now controlled by Franco-Castilian forces, England's overstretched empire began to unravel. Aquitaine, starved of reinforcements and supplies, became vulnerable to French reconquest. The cost of hiring mercenaries to replace lost troops drained Edward III's treasury, forcing punitive taxes that sparked unrest at home. Most crucially, the battle proved Charles V's strategy of alliances and targeted strikes could work where brute force had failed. Yet the real lesson of La Rochelle was about adaptation, or the lack of it. England, clinging to ships designed for Crécy-era warfare, had been outmaneuvered by an enemy that studied their weaknesses. The tide wasn't just turning, it was pulling England's ambitions out to sea, leaving Edward's heirs to face a war they no longer knew how to win. And across the Channel, a French king who'd once been dismissed as a scholar, not a soldier, allowed himself a rare smile. The chessboard was his at last. The walls of Bergerac had stood for generations, their weathered stones soaked with the sweat of English masons and the blood of French assaults. But in the autumn of 1377, those walls met something new, not the brute force of traditional siege warfare, but the cunning of Bertrand du Guesclin, a Breton knight whose scars told the story of France's slow rebirth. While English chroniclers dismissed him as the hedgehog for his bristly beard and unkempt appearance, du Guesclin fought with a mind as sharp as his sword. His campaign to reclaim Bergerac wasn't just about territory. It was a blueprint for how France would methodically dismantle England's crumbling empire. Previous French commanders had thrown men at fortified towns like waves breaking on cliffs. Du Guesclin took a different approach. His engineers spent weeks mapping Bergerac's weak points, not just the walls but the morale of its garrison. Spreading rumors of an impending French relief army, he let paranoia fester among the English defenders. Then came his masterstroke, sappers tunneling beneath the weakest tower under cover of night, their shovels muffled by the rhythmic clanging of blacksmiths repairing armor nearby. When the tower collapsed at dawn, it wasn't just stone that crumbled, it was the illusion of English invincibility. What made Du Guesclin dangerous wasn't just his tactics, but his understanding of the war's changing rhythm. English garrisons, stretched thin across dozens of towns, relied on predictable supply routes and seasonal reinforcements. The Breton commander exploited this with almost surgical precision. Cutting off Bergerac's access to the Dordogne River, he starved the defenders into desperation while French crossbowmen picked off anyone who dared scout beyond the gates. By the time his troops stormed the breached walls, half the garrison had already deserted or succumbed to disease. This victory signaled a seismic shift in leadership. The old French nobility, raised on chivalric charges and personal glory, found themselves eclipsed by men like Du Guesclin pragmatists who cared more about winning than about how it looked in tapestries. King Charles V, once mocked as a scholar unfit for war, had deliberately promoted these new commanders, rewarding competence over birthright. Meanwhile, England's aging Edward III watched helplessly as his network of fortresses, once thought unshakable, began collapsing like dominoes. Bergerac's fall wasn't an isolated event. It was the first stitch in a tapestry of reconquest. Within months, town after town would follow, each surrender eroding England's foothold in France. But the true lesson lay deeper. Wars weren't just won on battlefields, but in the patience to unravel an enemy thread by thread. Du Guesclin grasped this truth, and in doing so handed France its first real hope of victory in half a century. The tide had turned, not with a single dramatic clash, but through the quiet, relentless pressure of a noose tightening. The flames of rebellion in England during the summer of 1381 didn't just burn through London streets, they scorched the very foundations of royal authority. Wat Tyler's peasant revolt, often remembered for its dramatic clashes at Smithfield, was more than a protest against poll taxes. It was the explosive result of a kingdom stretched to its breaking point by the 100 Years' War. For decades, England had financed its continental ambitions by squeezing every penny from peasants and merchants alike. But after the disaster at La Rochelle and the loss of key French territories, the war's burden became unbearable. When tax collectors arrived in Essex and Kent demanding yet another payment, they weren't just met with refusal, they faced pitchforks, torches, and a fury that would shake the throne itself. King Richard II, just 14 years old, found himself confronting an army of rebels at Mile End. Their demands were startlingly specific: an end to serfdom, fair rents, and punishment for corrupt officials. But beneath these grievances lay a deeper truth: the war had bled England dry, and its people were no longer willing to suffer for ambitions they didn't share. The young king's promise of concessions temporarily quelled the uprising, but Wat Tyler's violent death during negotiations exposed the fragility of the peace. The rebellion's suppression was brutal, yet its message lingered like smoke in the air. England could no longer wage war abroad while ignoring chaos at home. Across the Channel, France faced its own turmoil. Charles V's death in 1380 had left the crown to his 12-year-old son, Charles VI, sparking rivalries among regents that paralyzed decision-making. Both kingdoms, exhausted by decades of conflict and internal strife, found themselves at an uneasy crossroads. The Truce of Leulingham in 1389 wasn't born of mutual goodwill but mutual desperation, a chance to regroup as dynastic instability threatened to unravel both nations from within. This truce, though often overlooked, revealed a crucial shift in the war's dynamics. Neither side had surrendered their claims, they'd simply run out of energy to pursue them. For 28 years, the fighting paused, but the roots of conflict remained, waiting for the next generation to revive them. The 100 Years' War wasn't over, it was merely catching its breath. And when it resumed, the battlefields would look very different, shaped by the lessons of peasant revolts and the quiet realization that no kingdom could wage eternal war without first securing the loyalty of its own people. Rain lashed the exhausted English army as they stumbled through the mud of northern France in October 1415. Henry V's campaign, meant to revive England's crumbling claims to the French throne, had become a desperate fight for survival. Dysentery had ravaged his troops, reducing them to a skeletal force of 6,000 men, their uniforms hanging loose on fever-racked bodies. Now, trapped between the swollen Somme River and a French host 3 times their size, they faced annihilation near the village of Agincourt. What happened next wasn't just a battle, it was a masterpiece of desperation meeting opportunity, where terrain and tactics would rewrite the rules of medieval warfare. Henry's genius lay in turning his weaknesses into strengths. The freshly plowed fields between 2 dense woods became his killing ground, their sodden earth churned into a quagmire by autumn rains. As dawn broke on October 25th, he arrayed his men in a narrow formation, flanked by forests that funneled the French advance into a lethal bottleneck. Then came his secret weapon, thousands of sharpened wooden stakes angled at chest height, driven into the ground by archers who'd spent the night transforming the field into a porcupine's nest of death. These weren't the defensive palisades of old, they were mobile traps designed to cripple the very heart of French might, their armored cavalry. When the French knights advanced, their arrogance proved their undoing. Ignoring lessons from Crécy and Poitiers, they charged headlong into the mud, their plate armor sinking them deeper with every step. English longbowmen, positioned on the flanks, loosed volley after volley into the chaotic mass, arrows finding gaps in visors and horseflesh alike. The stakes did the rest, impaling steeds, snapping lances, turning the charge into a tangled nightmare. French men-at-arms, struggling to rise under 60 pounds of waterlogged steel, were slaughtered where they fell by English knights wielding lead-weighted mallets. By midday, the field resembled a grotesque sculpture garden of the dead, with Henry himself fighting in the thick of it, his crown dented by a French axe blow. Agincourt's aftermath was as shocking as the battle itself. Nearly 6,000 French nobles lay dead, including the Constable of France and 3 dukes' losses that crippled the kingdom's leadership for a generation. Henry's ragged band, by contrast, suffered fewer than 400 casualties, but the true impact went beyond numbers. This wasn't just a victory, it was a propaganda coup that reignited English dreams of conquest. Within 2 years, Henry would secure the Treaty of Troyes, marrying the French Princess Catherine and being named heir to the fractured French throne. Yet Agincourt's legacy was double-edged. The very factors that enabled Henry's triumph, French disunity, reliance on heavy cavalry, and underestimation of English resilience, would eventually reverse themselves. The battle bought England time but not permanence. Like a firework lighting the sky before fading, its brilliance obscured a deeper truth. No single victory, no matter how spectacular, could sustain an empire built on borrowed glory. The war's next chapter would prove that even the mightiest kings couldn't outrun the tides of change, or the rising fury of a people who refused to be ruled from across the Channel. The once proud streets of Rouen in the winter of 1418 were a vision of medieval hell, a city reduced to eating its dead. As Henry V's siege engines pounded the walls day and night, the citizens of Normandy's capital faced a choice no one should ever have to make: starvation or unspeakable survival. Dogs and rats vanished first, then the leather from shoes and belts boiled into bitter soup. When even that ran out, whispers spread of darker meals consumed behind shuttered windows. A chronicler would later write of mothers disguising the origins of stews made with flesh no butcher sold. This wasn't just war, it was the unraveling of civilization itself. Henry's strategy at Rouen revealed a chilling precision. Unlike earlier medieval sieges where attackers might accept a city's surrender after token resistance, the English king understood Rouen's symbolic power. As Normandy's wealthiest city and a key link between Paris and the Channel, its fall would fracture French morale. He encircled the walls with trenches and wooden bastions, cutting off every supply route while his gunners methodically shattered the gates. Meanwhile, his uncle Thomas Beaufort blockaded the Seine, ensuring no grain barges could slip through. The message was clear: Rouen would submit or it would cease to exist. Inside the walls, desperation bred chaos. The Dauphinist garrison, loyal to the disinherited Charles VII, hoarded what little grain remained while civilians starved. When desperate townspeople tried to flee through the gates, English archers drove them back. Henry wanted the city's hunger to do his work for him. By December, the streets were littered with frozen corpses, their faces hollowed by famine. On Christmas Day, the city's magistrates sent out 12 emaciated orphans as a silent plea for mercy. Henry, unmoved, sent them back to die. The contrast between English cohesion and French fragmentation couldn't have been starker. While Henry's brother John of Bedford orchestrated the siege with clockwork efficiency, the Dauphin's faction squabbled over petty rivalries in burges. No relief army marched, no coordinated resistance emerged. When Rouen finally capitulated in January 1419, its surviving citizens, reduced to skeletal figures, were forced to pay an indemnity for the privilege of surrendering. Henry entered not as a conqueror, but as a grudging benefactor, distributing bread with one hand while tightening his grip with the other. Rouen's fall was more than a military defeat. It was a psychological earthquake. Normandy, held by the French for centuries, collapsed like a house of cards in the months that followed. Caen, Cherbourg, and Bayeux surrendered with barely a fight, their garrisons demoralized by Rouen's fate. Yet Henry's triumph carried the seeds of its own undoing. The brutality of the siege fueled a growing undercurrent of resentment, not just among the French, but within his own ranks. Soldiers who cheered their king's victories began whispering about the cost of glory measured in starved children and cannibalized corpses. The road to Paris now lay open, but the price of conquest would haunt England long after Henry's death. And waiting in the shadows, the Dauphin Charles, once dismissed as a feckless boy, would find his voice in the ashes of his people's suffering. The rolling fields near Bordeaux in March 1421 should have been another triumphant notch in England's belt, a chance to crush the remnants of French resistance after Agincourt's glory. Instead, they became the stage for one of the war's most stunning reversals, all because of a single reckless decision. Thomas, Duke of Clarence, Henry V's impulsive younger brother, didn't wait for reinforcements or even basic reconnaissance. Spotting what he thought was a vulnerable Franco-Scottish force, he led a headlong cavalry charge with barely 800 men. What he didn't see were the thousands of fresh troops hidden in the woods, or the muddy stream that would trap his knights like fish in a net. By sunset, Clarence lay dead, his golden surcoat trampled into the mud, and England's aura of invincibility shattered. This wasn't just a battle lost, it was a lesson in how alliances could rewrite the rules of war. The French and Scots, long-time rivals, had forged an unlikely partnership. Scottish archers, veterans of brutal border wars with England, fought side by side with French men-at-arms under the wily command of the Earl of Buchan. Their coordination was seamless. Scottish longbows pinned down English knights while French cavalry flanked them, exploiting the chaos of Clarence's disordered charge. The muddy terrain, so often England's ally at Agincourt, now turned against them as horses floundered and riders were dragged into the mire. For the first time in years, France had found a formula to counter English tactics, not with brute force, but with patience and unity. The psychological impact rippled across both kingdoms. In England, news of Clarence's death sent shockwaves through the nobility. Henry V, campaigning in Normandy, was forced to divert precious resources to stabilize the shaken front. Meanwhile, for Charles VII, the disinherited Dauphin holed up in Bourges-Bourget offered something he'd lacked since Agincourt: hope. The victory proved his fractured cause could still inspire loyalty, and more crucially, that England wasn't invincible. Scottish reinforcements began flowing south, drawn by the promise of land and prestige, while French commanders who'd hesitated to back the Dauphin now reconsidered. Yet Bourget's true significance lay in what it revealed about the war's shifting dynamics. England, stretched thin across occupied territories, could no longer rely on shock and awe to maintain control. France, though still divided, had discovered the power of adaptation using terrain, alliances, and enemy overconfidence as weapons. The battle didn't decide the war, but it cracked open a door that Charles would soon learn to widen. And waiting in the wings, a teenage peasant girl from Domremy would turn that flicker of hope into an inferno. But that's a story for another battle. Orléans in October 1428 was a city on the brink, its citizens watching the horizon for the flicker of English torches. For months, the Earl of Salisbury's forces had tightened their grip, building a ring of fortified bastions around the walls, cutting off food and hope in equal measure. The English weren't just laying siege, they were waging psychological warfare, confident that without outside intervention, the city would crumble. What they hadn't accounted for was the arrival of a 17-year-old girl wearing armor and carrying a banner stitched with the names of saints. Joan of Arc didn't just bring reinforcements, she brought something far more dangerous to the English cause, a belief that God had chosen France to win. The siege had ground to a stalemate by the time Joan arrived in April 1429. English troops, stretched thin across their occupied territories, were exhausted from months of trench digging and skirmishing. Their commanders, squabbling over strategy after Salisbury's death to a stray cannonball, lacked the fervor that had once driven Henry V's campaigns. Into this vacuum of doubt strode Joan, her unshakable conviction cutting through the war weariness like a sword through fog. She didn't just inspire the French soldiers, she terrified the English, who whispered that she must be a witch or a demon. How else could a peasant girl rally broken men to fight again? Joan's tactics were as unorthodox as her rise. Rather than waiting for a grand battle, she led daring sorties against individual English bastions, exploiting weak points with near-clairvoyant precision. At the fortified Augustins, she rallied fleeing French troops mid-retreat, turning panic into a counterattack that overran the position. When she was wounded by an arrow at the Tourelles fortress, she yanked it out herself and climbed back into the fray, her banner visible above the smoke. Each small victory chipped away at English morale until the impossible happened. On May 8th, the besiegers abandoned their camps and fled, leaving behind supplies, cannons, and their aura of invincibility. The fall of Orléans wasn't just a military turning point, it was a seismic shift in the war's soul. The French, who'd spent a generation doubting their right to rule, now fought with the zeal of the chosen. The English, who'd once believed their kings were destined to rule France, began questioning the cost of divine ambition. Joan's greatest weapon wasn't her sword, it was the story she embodied, one that turned a grimy siege into a legend. And though her flame would burn bright and brief, the spark she lit at Orléans would outlast her, setting the stage for a France reborn. The next battle wouldn't be fought over walls or rivers, but over the very idea of a nation, and for the first time since Agincourt, the French remembered what it meant to believe. The fields outside Patay in June 1429 shimmered under a merciless sun, the air thick with the scent of trampled wheat and nervous sweat. Sir John Talbot, England's most feared commander, had positioned his longbowmen in their classic defensive formation, stakes planted, arrows nocked ready to repeat the victories of Crécy and Agincourt. But this time the French weren't walking into the trap. This time they'd learned to fight fire with lightning. La Hire, the gruff mercenary captain who'd fought alongside Joan of Arc at Orléans, led the charge with a brutality that shocked even his own men. Spotting Talbot's vanguard through the morning mist, he didn't wait for orders or formations. With a roar that could have split oak, his cavalry surged forward like a scythe through ripe grain. The English archers barely had time to loose a single volley before armored horses were among them, splintering their defensive stakes and trampling men into the dirt. Talbot's carefully arranged lines dissolved into chaos, his archers deadly at range but helpless in close combat, cut down as they fled. By midday, the road to Patay was littered with English dead, and Talbot himself was dragged from a garden where he'd tried to hide, his pride as shattered as his army. What made Patay so devastating wasn't just the French victory, but how it was won. For decades, English commanders had relied on static defenses, betting that disciplined archers could outlast any charge. But La Hire and his fellow captains had studied their enemy's playbook too well. They attacked not with the lumbering frontal assaults of old, but with targeted fury, scouts pinpointing weaknesses, cavalry striking before the English could dig in, and momentum replacing brute force. This was mobility as weaponized as the longbow had once been, proving that speed could undo even the most entrenched defenses. The battle's aftermath revealed just how far the pendulum had swung. With Talbot captured and his elite archers annihilated, the road to Rheims lay open. Weeks later, Charles VII would be crowned in the very cathedral where English ambitions had faltered decades earlier, his legitimacy cemented not by slow sieges, but by the thunder of hooves and the lesson of Patay, that wars are won by those who adapt fastest. The English still held castles and territory, but their aura of inevitability had crumbled like a rotted stake in the mud. And somewhere in the French camp, Joan of Arc knelt in prayer, her voices whispering that the tide had turned at last. The road to Rheims in the summer of 1429 wasn't paved with strategy alone, it was lined with miracles, or at least the careful illusion of them. Joan of Arc, still glowing from her triumph at Orléans, didn't just lead an army. She staged a coronation procession designed to unravel English claims stitch by stitch. Every liberated town along the way, Jargeau, Meung, Beaugency, wasn't merely a military objective but a piece of political theater. As gates swung open without sieges and garrisons surrendered after token resistance, it became clear Joan wasn't just winning battles, she was rewriting the narrative of a war-weary France. Charles VII, trailing behind her with his entourage of skeptical nobles, watched in awe as villages that had paid taxes to England for years now cheered his name. The Maid's presence turned pragmatic calculations into acts of divine providence. When Troyes, a Burgundian stronghold, initially barred its gates, Joan urged a night of prayer, only for the city's leaders to wake to rumors of English reinforcements fleeing. By dawn, they were negotiating terms, coincidence perhaps, but in the minds of peasants and princes alike, it was proof God favored the Dauphin's cause. Yet behind the spectacle lay grinding logistical genius. Joan's commanders La Hire, the Duke of Alençon, knew miracles didn't feed armies. They secured supply lines through the Champagne countryside, bribed Burgundian captains to look the other way, and timed their marches to avoid pitched battles. The English, scattered and demoralized after Patay, could only harry their flanks. Even the weather conspired in their favor. Dry roads sped their advance, while unseasonal rains slowed pursuers. When Charles finally knelt in Rheims Cathedral on July 17th, the oil of Clovis anointing his brow, the moment crackled with layered meaning. For the French, it was the healing of a national wound, the first rightful coronation since the Treaty of Troyes had disinherited him. For Joan, it was the fulfillment of her visions, but for the English, it was a masterstroke of psychological warfare. Charles was no longer the King of Burges, a pretender ruling over scraps. He was God's anointed, his legitimacy etched into the collective memory of every peasant who'd watched the procession. The campaign's brilliance lay in its duality. Every sword stroke served symbolism, every mile marched was a sermon preached. Joan understood what seasoned generals had forgotten. In a war of crowns, perception could be deadlier than steel. Yet even as the cathedral bells pealed, the limits of her magic were already showing. Rheims hadn't been won by siege but by surrender. The real test, holding a fractured kingdom together, would demand less prophecy and more politics. And politics, as Charles would soon learn, rarely listened to angels. The Burgundian court in Arras glittered with deception in the summer of 1435, its tapestries muffling whispers that would doom English dreams of France. Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy, had spent years as England's most powerful ally. His father's murder by the Dauphin's faction had made him a natural partner against Charles VII. But as the Treaty of Arras took shape behind closed doors, a colder truth emerged. Blood feuds mattered less than Burgundy's hunger for autonomy. The document's clauses weren't just terms of peace. They were a masterclass in political betrayal, stripping England of its last credible continental ally with the stroke of a pen. John of Bedford, England's regent in France, had sensed the shift coming. His letters to London grew increasingly frantic, warning of Burgundy's wavering constancy. Yet diplomacy wasn't Bedford's strength. He was a soldier, accustomed to sieges rather than salons. While he marshaled troops to defend Normandy, Philip's envoys were already negotiating with Charles, trading military support for territorial concessions and a royal pardon for his father's death. The real prize, Burgundy's release from feudal obligations to the French crown, effectively making Philip a sovereign ruler in all but name. For a duke whose court outshone many kingdoms, this was worth more than any English gold. The treaty's immediate impact was catastrophic for England. Overnight, their supply routes through Burgundian territory evaporated. Paris, already restless under English occupation, now faced the specter of Burgundian troops switching sides. But the deeper wound was psychological. After decades of portraying Charles as a usurper, England's narrative crumbled when his greatest enemy embraced him as rightful king. The Anglo-Burgundian alliance, painstakingly built through marriages and treaties since 1420, dissolved like salt in rain. Bedford's death weeks later, some said of a broken heart, symbolized England's fading grip. Without Burgundy's resources, maintaining garrisons became a losing game of whack-a-mole. Towns that had sworn loyalty to Henry VI now eyed the rising star of French reconquest. Yet Philip's betrayal wasn't purely cynical. It revealed a fundamental miscalculation by English strategists. they'd assumed shared enemies guaranteed lasting alliances, while Burgundy played a longer game. In the end, realpolitik trumped revenge, leaving England to face a war it could no longer win by proxy. The chessboard had been flipped, and the next moves would unfold not in diplomatic chambers, but in the blood-soaked fields of Normandy. The muddy fields near Formigny in April 1450 bore witness to something unprecedented: the thunder of French cannon fire, shredding the English defensive squares that had dominated European battlefields for a century. This wasn't just another clash in the endless war. It was the moment gunpowder announced itself as the future of warfare. The English, still relying on the tactics that had brought them glory at Agincourt and Crécy, formed their classic defensive formation: dismounted men at arms flanked by archers, their stakes planted firmly in the earth. But this time the French didn't charge headlong into a storm of arrows. Instead, they rolled forward two sleek bronze culverins, their muzzles gleaming in the spring sunlight. For decades, artillery had been an unpredictable novelty, too cumbersome for rapid deployment, too slow to reload. But at Formigny, the French gunners demonstrated terrifying precision. Their first shots weren't aimed at the English lines, but at the wooden stakes protecting them, splintering the defensive barrier like kindling. Suddenly exposed, the archers who had once ruled the battlefield found themselves outranged by iron balls that punched through armor at 300 paces. Panic spread as the English ranks realized their formations, honed over generations, were now death traps. The battle's turning point came when French cavalry, held in reserve until the cannons had done their work, swept around the disordered English flank. What followed wasn't a fight but a slaughter. Men who'd survived the bombardment now trampled under hooves or cut down as they fled toward the nearby river. By afternoon, the fields were littered with the bodies of 4,000 English soldiers, their once vaunted longbows lying broken beside them. Formigny's significance stretched far beyond its body count. It marked the irreversible decline of medieval warfare's bedrock, the supremacy of disciplined infantry and archery. The French, long the victims of English tactical innovation, had finally outpaced their rivals by embracing the very technology the English High Command dismissed as unreliable. While Henry VI's advisors still debated the merits of cannons, Charles VII's artillery trains were already rumbling toward Normandy's remaining strongholds. Yet the battle also revealed a deeper truth about the war's final phase. England wasn't just losing territory, it was losing the ability to adapt. The same stubbornness that had made their armies formidable now left them vulnerable to a changing world. As smoke from French gunpowder drifted over Formigny's corpses, one could almost hear the creak of history's hinge, a medieval era ending and something far more explosive beginning. The 100 Years' War had always been a conflict of innovation, but now the innovation had a voice, and it spoke in thunder. The wine-dark waters of the Garonne River mirrored the flames consuming Bordeaux's outskirts in the summer of 1451, as the last English outpost in France fought not for a king, but for its own survival. For 3 centuries, Gascony had been more English than France. Its merchants grew rich trading claret to London. Its nobles spoke a bastardized Anglo-Occitan, and its very identity was woven into England's imperial tapestry. When Charles VII's army arrived to reclaim it, they didn't face an occupied city, but a people who believed themselves betrayed by their own crown. What followed wasn't just a military campaign, it was the violent unraveling of a shared history where local pride collided with the birth pangs of a unified France. Bordeaux's revolt began with a whisper campaign in the back rooms of wine merchants' guilds. The French occupation under Dunois, the famed bastard of Orléans, had started with surprising leniency. Taxes were light, pardons were issued to former collaborators. But Gascons soon chafed under new trade restrictions cutting off their lifeblood, the English wool that bought their wine. When Charles ordered the demolition of the city's iconic English-built fortifications, it wasn't just walls that fell, it was the illusion that Gascony could remain a world apart. By winter, secret envoys were slipping down river to beg England's aging Henry VI for salvation. The English response was both too little and too late. A ragtag expeditionary force under veteran commander John Talbot landed in October 1452, greeted by citizens waving embroidered banners of St. George, but this wasn't the disciplined army of Agincourt. It was a patchwork of mercenaries and nostalgic knights, outnumbered and outgunned. Talbot, now in his 70s, still fought like a man possessed, his silver beard flaring beneath his helmet as he led cavalry charges through the vineyards of Castillon. Yet even his heroics couldn't compensate for France's overwhelming advantage in artillery and fresh troops. What made the Gaskin Revolt so poignant was its fundamental contradiction. Bordeaux's leaders spoke of loyalty to England, yet their rebellion was fueled by something far more local, a fierce regional identity that resisted Paris as much as it did London. Their cry of Gascon ha nostra, our Gascony, rang hollow to French commanders who saw only treasonous provincialism. When the city finally fell in October 1453 after a brutal blockade, Charles offered surprising clemency, not out of mercy, but because he understood that true conquest required assimilation, not annihilation. The fall of Bordeaux extinguished more than English hopes. It marked the death of a medieval dream. For over 100 years, England's kings had imagined a dual monarchy spanning the Channel. Now, even the Gascons who'd wept for Talbot's death at Castillon adapted to French rule, their children speaking the king's Parisian French rather than the Occitan of their grandparents. The 100 Years' War had begun with dynastic claims and feudal posturing. It ended with the quiet, inexorable rise of something new, nation-states that would tolerate no divided loyalties. And as the last English ships disappeared over the horizon, the Garonne's tides carried away more than soldiers. They washed clean the shores of a continent forever changed. The sun-baked fields outside Castillon in July 1453 seemed to tremble under the weight of history itself, not just from the French cannons embedded in their earthen fortifications, but from the sheer inevitability of what was about to unfold. John Talbot, the grizzled English commander whose career had spanned the war's twilight years, surveyed the scene with a mix of defiance and despair. Before him lay not the open fields of Agincourt or the muddy slopes of Crécy, but something far more modern, a labyrinth of trenches, palisades, and gun emplacements manned by French artillery crews who'd spent weeks preparing this killing ground. The 100 Years' War, which had begun with the thunder of cavalry charges, would meet its end in the smoke-filled dawn of gunpowder warfare, and Talbot, the last lion of England's fading empire, would charge headlong into obsolescence. What made Castillon so jarring was its brutal efficiency. The French commander, Jean Bureau, a former tax collector turned artillery master, had engineered a defensive masterpiece. His cannons weren't scattered haphazardly but arranged in overlapping fields of fire, their positions camouflaged by brush and earthworks. Trenches zigzagged between gun pits, allowing troops to reinforce weak points without exposing themselves. This wasn't medieval warfare. It was a prototype of the siege tactics that would dominate Europe for centuries, and Talbot, for all his courage, was about to wage a 14th century battle against 15th century technology. When the attack came, it was less a charge than a funeral procession. Spurred by false reports that the French were retreating, Talbot's men advanced without waiting for reinforcements, their banners fluttering in the humid air. The first volley of French gunfire ripped through the English lines like a scythe, cutting down knights and archers alike. Iron cannonballs, heated until they glowed red, ignited the dry summer grass, trapping wounded men in rings of fire. Talbot, his leg shattered by a shot, was pulled from his horse and finished off by a French infantryman who didn't recognize the old warrior until after his dagger had struck. The battle lasted barely an hour, but its message echoed across the continent. The age of chivalric heroics was dead, and wars would now be won by engineers and accountants as much as by knights. Castillon's aftermath was as anticlimactic as it was decisive. There were no grand treaties signed, no dramatic surrenders, just a slow unraveling. Bordeaux held out for 3 more months, but without hope of relief. Its citizens finally opened their gates to Charles VII's army in October. The English crown, embroiled in the bloody chaos of the Wars of the Roses, lacked the resources or will to mount another invasion. Like a candle guttering in its socket, the 100 Years' War didn't so much end as exhaust itself, leaving behind a map redrawn by gunpowder and nationalism. Yet the battle's true legacy lay in its quiet revolution. Bureau's trenches at Castillon foreshadowed the future of warfare, a future where terrain, logistics, and technology mattered more than individual valor. The longbow, once England's great equalizer, had been rendered obsolete by the cannon's roar, and France, which had entered the war as a fractured feudal kingdom, emerged as a centralized state with a standing army and a newfound sense of identity. The conflict that began over a disputed crown ended by answering a far deeper question: not who would rule France, but what France even meant. The answer, written in blood and fire at Castillon, was that nations could no longer be held together by oaths alone. They required walls, wages, and weapons fit for a new age. England's early dominance in the 100 Years' War wasn't just luck, it was a revolution in military thinking, forged in the fires of necessity. The longbow, that unassuming 6-foot stave of yew, became the great equalizer, turning peasant yeomen into the deadliest force on the continent. At Crécy and Agincourt, English commanders like Edward III and Henry V exploited terrain and discipline to humble the flower of French chivalry. Their secret, a ruthless pragmatism that treated warfare as a science rather than a stage for chivalric glory. Archers didn't just soften the enemy, they shattered cavalry charges before they began, while dismounted knights held the line with grim efficiency. This wasn't just tactics, it was a cultural shift where victory mattered more than vanity. But brilliance often sows the seeds of its own downfall. England's reliance on the longbow became a double-edged sword, a masterpiece of specialization that left little room for adaptation. For nearly a century, the formula worked: find defensible ground, plant stakes, and let arrows do the rest. Yet by the time French commanders like du Guesclin and Bureau began innovating using mobile artillery, targeted sieges, and guerrilla tactics, England's military playbook had fossilized. The same generals who once outmaneuvered kings now clung to old victories like talismans, blind to the gunpowder revolution unfolding before them. At Formigny and Castillon, French cannons didn't just outrange longbows, they rendered them obsolete, reducing England's once unstoppable formations to target practice. The deeper tragedy lay in England's strategic overreach. Early wins like Poitiers and Agincourt created an illusion of inevitability, masking the unsustainable cost of holding territories across the Channel. Each captured fortress demanded garrisons. Each victory siphoned gold and manpower from an island kingdom with finite resources. While France centralized under Charles VII, building a standing army and modern tax system, England's feudal levies and ad hoc financing buckled under the strain. The War of the Roses, that bloody civil conflict waiting in the wings, wasn't just a dynastic squabble, it was the bill coming due for a century of continental ambition. In the end, England's greatest strength, the ability to punch above its weight, became its fatal flaw. The longbow's golden age proved that innovation wins battles, but inflexibility loses wars. The lesson echoed far beyond medieval battlefields. No advantage lasts forever, and the moment you stop adapting is the moment the world leaves you behind. France, once the victim of English ingenuity, had learned this truth too well. By the war's end, it wasn't just a matter of who held which castle, but which kingdom had the vision to face the future, and which remained trapped in the past. France's journey through the 100 Years' War wasn't just a saga of survival. It was a metamorphosis, a slow burning away of medieval fragmentation to reveal the bones of a nation. In the early years of the conflict, the very idea of France as a unified entity would have seemed laughable to its own nobility. The kingdom was a patchwork of semi-independent duchies and counties, where Burgundians often felt more kinship with English wool merchants than with the distant court in Paris. Yet by the war's end, something remarkable had taken root, a shared identity forged not in victory, but in the crucible of humiliation. The turning point wasn't a single battle, but a series of existential shocks that forced France to reinvent itself. After the catastrophic defeats at Crécy and Poitiers, where the flower of French chivalry fell to English arrows, a hard truth became unavoidable: feudal levies and individual heroism couldn't win this war. Charles V, known as the Wise, understood this better than anyone. While history remembers his father as the captive of Poitiers and his son as the disinherited Dauphin, it was Charles who laid the groundwork for France's resurrection. His reign saw the birth of a professional army paid directly by the crown, bypassing unreliable noble levies. He invested in artillery decades before it became decisive, and perhaps most crucially, he established a permanent system of taxation that turned war financing from a desperate scramble into a predictable machine. But the real miracle wasn't bureaucratic, it was psychological. The war taught France that its greatest weakness wasn't lack of courage, but lack of unity. The schism between Armagnacs and Burgundians, which had nearly delivered the kingdom to Henry V, became a cautionary tale. By the time Joan of Arc rallied the nation at Orléans, she wasn't just fighting the English, she was embodying an idea that France belonged to all its people, not just to squabbling nobles. Her campaigns, though militarily modest, ignited something far more powerful than battlefield tactics: a sense of collective destiny. Military innovation followed this cultural shift. French commanders, once wedded to glorious cavalry charges, adopted ruthless pragmatism. Bert and du Guesclin's guerrilla campaigns in the 1370s showed how small, mobile forces could starve English garrisons into submission without pitched battles. Later, Jean Bureau's artillery corps at Castillon demonstrated how technology could render traditional defenses obsolete. These weren't just tactical evolutions. They reflected a deeper transformation in how France conceived of power. The monarchy that emerged from the war wasn't just stronger, it was different. Its authority rooted less in feudal oaths and more in the ability to protect and govern. Perhaps the most telling symbol of this rebirth was the fate of the royal treasury. In 1356, John II's ransom had bankrupted France. A century later, Charles VII funded standing armies and cannon foundries without blinking. The war had forced the kingdom to build institutions that outlasted any single king: a bureaucracy, a tax base, a sense of statehood that transcended personal loyalties. When the final English garrison sailed home from Bordeaux in 1453, they weren't just leaving territory, they were leaving a nation that had discovered itself in the fire. The irony is rich. England's victories taught France how to win. Every Crécy, every Agincourt, every humiliating treaty became a lesson in what not to be. By the time the cannons fell silent, France stood not as a collection of fiefdoms bound by fragile alliances, but as something recognizably modern, a centralized state with a monopoly on violence, a national identity, and the administrative machinery to sustain both. The phoenix didn't just rise from the ashes, it grew wings of steel. Behind every charge of knights and volley of arrows lay a quieter, more insidious battleground, one where silver coins and wool sacks decided fates as surely as swords. The 100 Years' War wasn't just fought with steel, it was waged with tax ledgers, trade routes, and the desperate sweat of peasants whose backs bore the true cost of kings' ambitions. While chroniclers glorified battles, the real war often raged in market squares and counting houses, where economic sabotage could cripple an enemy more effectively than any cavalry. England's greatest vulnerability wasn't its army, but its wool. The trade in raw English fleeces to Flemish weavers funded nearly a third of the kingdom's war expenses, making Flanders the Achilles heel of Edward III's ambitions. When Philip VI of France blockaded Flemish ports in 1336, he didn't just cut off cloth, he strangled England's cash flow. The English response was as ruthless as it was ingenious. They redirected their wool exports to rival Brabant, undercutting French allied Flemish merchants until their guilds revolted. Economic warfare had become a game of chess with wool sacks as the pieces. Yet this reliance on a single commodity carried peril. By the 1420s, when Burgundy switched sides, England's once lucrative trade network lay in tatters, its treasury bleeding gold to pay mercenaries who'd once been funded by fleeces. France, meanwhile, played a darker hand with its currency. Charles V's advisors mastered the art of financial alchemy, repeatedly debasing coins to stretch war funds, then suddenly restoring their value to shock the economy. A liver in 1370 could buy half what it did a decade prior, a hidden tax on every peasant and merchant. This monetary sleight of hand funded standing armies and cannon foundries, but at a corrosive cost. Trust in the crown's money evaporated, sparking riots like the Maillotin uprising in Paris. Yet for all its brutality, the strategy worked. While England clung to parliamentary taxes that sparked revolts, France's stealthier fiscal erosion bought time to rebuild, rearm, and wait for English overextension to take its toll. The true victims of this silent warfare weren't kings or merchants, but the nameless thousands whose labor fueled the machine. English peasants faced the hated poll tax, a flat levy that sparked the 1481 rebellion when a collector's demand for payment from a grieving widow became the spark for Wat Tyler's revolt. French serfs, already crushed by war levies, watched as roaming mercenaries, écorcheurs, or skinners, stripped their villages bare between official battles. Both kingdoms resorted to desperate measures. England pawned the royal jewels to Genoese bankers, while France melted church silver into coins. The lesson was grimly clear: courage on the battlefield meant little when supply chains snapped or tax collectors met pitchforks. In the end, economics shaped the war's outcome as decisively as any general. England's failure wasn't just military, it was fiscal. The cost of garrisoning Normandy and Gascony drained its treasury dry, while France's centralized tax system, though brutal, proved more sustainable. When the final reckoning came at Castillon, it wasn't just French cannons that overwhelmed the English, it was the weight of 100 years of debt, disruption, and economic exhaustion. Wars might be remembered for their battles, but they are won by the kingdoms that can keep the coins flowing, and the people working lessons as relevant today as in the age of longbows and plate armor. The clang of the blacksmith's hammer echoed differently by the war's end, no longer shaping the sleek plate armor that once made knights near invincible, but forging the bronze barrels of cannons that would render those same knights obsolete. The 100 Years' War didn't just pit kingdoms against each other. It became a laboratory for military innovation, where survival depended on who could outthink as much as outfight their enemy. At the war's outset, English longbowmen and French knights embodied two distinct eras of combat, yet by its close, both would be eclipsed by the roar of gunpowder, a transformation so profound it didn't just change the war's outcome, but the very nature of warfare itself. England's early dominance rested on a paradox. The simplest weapon in the medieval arsenal became the most lethal. The longbow, carved from yew and strung with hemp, required years of training to master, but could loose arrows faster and farther than any crossbow. At Crécy and Agincourt, this unassuming tool turned peasant levies into an engine of destruction, its arrows piercing armor at 200 paces. Yet the English didn't just rely on the bow's power, they built an entire system around it. Archers were drilled to fire in disciplined volleys, their stakes forming makeshift fortresses that channeled enemy charges into killing zones. This wasn't just technology, it was a revolution in tactics, where coordination and terrain amplified raw firepower. France's response to this threat revealed the limits of tradition. Initially, they doubled down on the very tactics that failed them: heavier armor, grander charges, more elaborate heraldry. A knight's suit of plate by the mid-1400s could weigh 60 pounds, turning warriors into near-impervious tanks on the battlefield. But mobility suffered, and as the war dragged on, French commanders began to grasp that surviving English arrows required more than thicker steel. It demanded a complete rethink of warfare. Enter Bertrand du Guesclin, the Breton general who abandoned chivalric pomp for guerrilla pragmatism. His campaigns avoided pitched battles altogether, instead starving English garrisons through scorched earth tactics and rapid sieges. The lesson was clear: adaptation, not tradition, would win the war. The true game-changer, however, emerged from an unexpected quarter: the alchemist's workshop. Gunpowder, once a novelty used for fireworks, became the great equalizer. Early cannons were temperamental beasts prone to exploding, slow to reload, and useless in wet weather. Yet by the 1400s, French engineers like Jean Bureau had refined them into siege-breaking monsters. At Castillon, Bureau's artillery didn't just outrange longbows, it demolished the very idea of static defense, reducing England's carefully arranged formations to smoldering wreckage in minutes. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical. Soldiers who'd faced arrows with stoicism fled at the cannon's thunder, knowing no armor could stop a 12-pound iron ball. What made this technological arms race so pivotal was its asymmetry. England, wedded to the longbow's proven success, struggled to innovate beyond it. Their occasional use of gunpowder, like the primitive ribeldequin at Agincourt, remained experimental. France, by contrast, embraced change out of necessity. By the war's end, their armies fielded standardized artillery trains and handguns, while English commanders still debated the longbow's supremacy. This divergence didn't just decide battles, it signaled a broader shift in how wars would be fought. The medieval model of feudal levies and heroic charges gave way to professional armies, centralized logistics, and state-funded arsenals. The legacy of this transformation reached far beyond the 100 Years' War. The conflict's final battles, Formigny, Castillon, were previews of the early modern battlefield, where massed firepower and engineering eclipsed individual bravery. France's eventual victory wasn't just a triumph of territory, but of institutional learning, a kingdom that could absorb defeats, adapt its tools, and reorganize its armies around new realities. England, for all its early brilliance, clung to past glories until they became liabilities. In this way, the war didn't just end with a French king on the throne. It ended with gunpowder on the horizon, heralding a world where wars would be won not by the strongest arm, but by the most inventive mind. The clash of swords at Crécy and Agincourt didn't just spill blood, it shattered an entire worldview. Chivalry, that glittering code of knightly honor, had long been Europe's moral compass, dictating everything from battlefield conduct to royal diplomacy. Yet as the 100 Years' War ground on, its ideals crumbled like gilded armor under cannon fire. Chroniclers like Jean Froissart, who once painted war as a tapestry of heroic duels and noble sacrifice, began recording a grimmer truth: kings who broke truces for advantage, knights who ransomed peasants into starvation, and battles where arrow storms butchered the highborn alongside the humble. The romance of warfare gave way to its reality, and in that reckoning something unexpected emerged: not just disillusionment, but a new sense of collective identity. Listen closely to the voices rising from this chaos, and you'll hear the first whispers of nationalism. When Joan of Arc declared her divine mission to crown Charles VII, she didn't appeal to feudal loyalty or dynastic claims. She spoke of France as a sacred entity worth dying for. Peasants who'd once identified solely with their local lords now found themselves part of a larger story, their fates tied to crowns rather than counties. This shift echoed in language itself. Latin, the tongue of scholars and clerics, retreated before the surge of vernacular pride. English chronicles boasted of yeomen's victories at Agincourt, while French poets like Christine de Pizan penned defenses of their homeland in the common tongue, not the courtly French of Paris. The war wasn't just fought with weapons, it was waged with words that carved nations into being. Yet this transformation was uneven, even contradictory. The same war that birthed patriotic fervor also exposed its dark underbelly. In England, victories fueled a toxic exceptionalism, a belief that God favored English longbows over French folly. Across the Channel, defeat bred introspection, then resurgence. Charles V's librarians meticulously collected maps and treatises, reframing France not as a collection of fiefs, but as a geographical and cultural whole. By the war's end, maps began depicting clearly bordered kingdoms rather than vague feudal allegiances, a visual revolution as profound as any battlefield innovation. The deepest change, however, lay in how ordinary people saw themselves. When Burgundian chroniclers wrote of the French enemy, they weren't describing foreign invaders but their own neighbors, a mental shift unimaginable a century earlier. War had drawn lines not just on parchment but in hearts and minds. The medieval world, with its tangled web of personal oaths and overlapping loyalties, gave way to something simpler and starker: the idea that soil and blood defined destiny. It would take centuries for nationalism to reach its modern form, but the seeds were planted in the scorched earth of the 100 Years' War, watered by the tears of those who realized too late that glory was dead and something far more enduring had taken its place. The last English ships may have retreated from Bordeaux in 1453, but the 100 Years' War never truly ended. It simply shape-shifted. Those 11 decades of bloodshed didn't just redraw borders, they forged the DNA of modern Europe. Consider the standing army, a concept Charles VII pioneered to replace unreliable feudal levies. Those professional soldiers marching under the fleur-de-lis were the ancestors of today's national militaries, funded by another wartime innovation: centralized taxation. The war birthed bureaucracies that outlasted kings, turning medieval kingdoms into early states capable of wielding power far beyond any single monarch's lifespan. Look closer and you'll see the war's fingerprints everywhere. The very idea of fixed national borders crystallized during this conflict, as the Treaty of Brétigny's territorial clauses gave way to more precise maps and fortified frontiers. Even the seeds of European colonialism were sown here. England's loss of continental territories pushed its ambitions westward, setting the stage for future voyages across the Atlantic. The war didn't just change who ruled which castle, it reshaped how people imagined belonging. When Joan of Arc spoke of France, she wasn't invoking a patchwork of fiefdoms but a nation, an idea so potent it could inspire peasants to take up arms for a cause greater than their village. Yet the most haunting legacy lies in the unresolved tensions. The English crown never formally renounced its claim to the French throne until 1802, a technicality that simmered beneath centuries of Anglo-French rivalry. The same gunpowder that decided Castillon would go on to dominate European battlefields for generations, while the mercenary companies spawned by the war became the roving scourge of the Renaissance. Perhaps most tellingly, the conflict's final battles didn't conclude with a grand peace, but with exhaustion, a template for future wars where victory meant outlasting rather than overwhelming. So was this really a single war, or a series of connected conflicts that never found closure? The trenches of World War I traced lines first dug at Agincourt, and the European Union's birth owed much to ending cycles of Franco-British competition. Even now, when diplomats debate sovereignty or strategists study asymmetric warfare, they walk paths paved by Edward III's ambitions and Charles VII's reforms. The 100 Years' War didn't end at Castillon, it simply folded itself into the fabric of history, whispering through the centuries that no conflict ever truly dies. It only waits patiently for the next generation to give it new form. If these echoes of the past intrigue you, join us as we unravel more of history's decisive moments, where the battles fought then still shape the world